words, a lot of what's going on in these various holographic realities are like ink blots.
Right. They can be interpreted like dreams as well, that they have psychological symbols in them. But they're also something real there, because UFOs can be tracked on radar. They leave circles, on the ground. They leave traces of physical evidence. And so I think, I'm reminded there's a story, I don't know if it's apocryphal. I've never really been able to track it down. It's been attributed to Darwin Magellan, but something to the sense that if you use Magellan, that when Magellan first went ashore in Tierra del Fuego, that the natives saw that he came ashore in rowboats, but he left his ship anchored out in the harbor. And they said, well, how did you get here? And he said, in that ship. And they couldn't see the ship.
Yes.
And we certainly know that there's evidence of this. There are tribes in the Gold Coast of Africa that can't see photographs or can't see movies. And that there's sometimes, that there seems to be our cultural upbringing imprints in us what we can perceive, that sometimes we literally can't perceive something because we don't have the vocabulary, the cultural and perceptual vocabulary to see it. I think UFOs fall into that category in a very extreme way, that they are so alien to our ordinary perception that our brain really pulls deep psychological baggage out of our psyches to hammer them into some form. And when we look at them and read them at face value, like that they're abductions or whatever, I think that we're looking at our own unconscious interpretation of the phenomena, and that we have to go deeper. We have to see beyond our own psychological baggage to truly begin to recognize and understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Well, it would seem to me that it's true that we've been blinded by our culture. We're very much like the people as described in Plato's cave, who can only see the shadows on the wall and not the light. But yet I feel that something's happening. There is a movement in the culture. The very fact that you can take a rather respectable scientific concept like the holographic model of the brain and the holographic model in physics and see that it can be, without a lot of stretching, used to incorporate many of these very things. And Pribram, for one, acknowledges that as well, suggests that, right or wrong, the model is helping us to open our eyes to these
I think
things.
so, yeah. It's interesting. There's sort of a bit of a movement afoot to begin to look at these things, because it's kind of the story of the blind man and the elephant, where they go up, one touches the trunk, one touches the leg, and says, well, this animal's like a snake, no, this animal's like a tree, because they're not seeing the whole picture. And there are various researchers, for example, Ken Ring, who I mentioned earlier, the near-death experience researcher, who said, look, let's look at UFO experiences, let's look at shamanistic experiences, and let's look at near-death experiences, and look at their similarities. Maybe they're all portions of some proverbial elephant that we're missing. And I think he's right. I think that they're all experiences with the other channels on the holographic TV set. And when we interpret them at face value, they're extraterrestrials come here to abduct us and perform genetic research or whatever, we're being like the blind man and the elephant. Yeah. And we've got to look at the larger picture.
Yeah. Now, have you, in your adult life, had further UFO experiences as a follow-up?
Well, I have had, as an adult, I had a period when I was in college where I was driving with a friend, and we saw a UFO and got out of our car. We were going from East Lansing, Michigan to Saugatuck, which I believe was something like a 2-hour drive. I'm not quite sure, but we knew how long the drive was supposed to take. We got out of our car to watch this UFO, and we watched it for what we thought was about 5 minutes, and we made no other stops. And when we arrived at our destination, all of our friends said, where have you been? You're hours late. And this was the first time that we looked at our watches and realized that we had this proverbial missing time, that we had lost time. Now, I've had people try to hypnotize me, and unfortunately, I have not gone under to be able to access what occurred in that missing time. But I believe that, something, I had some encounter with this non-ordinary reality that we're, in this particular instance, labeling UFO, but as I say, is just the tip of the iceberg of something vast.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned the pieces of the puzzle earlier, and one piece that we haven't touched on I'd like to bring in now relates to past lives. You've written a book, Your Past Lives, on this very topic. Do you see it relating?
Oh, I do very much so. I think we human beings know so little about the universe. And I had another personal experience that I had was when I was a very small child. I remembered my past lives, fragments of them. I did not know the word reincarnation. I was very confused. But the memories and my realization that I had lived before were so vivid that I wouldn't call my parents mom and dad. I didn't understand why these two kindly people were saying they were my parents, because I knew I had other parents. I thought, where am I? why am I here? And I remembered different periods of history that I didn't know what periods they were. It was a visual memory, and it was very confusing for me. And I would always manifest all these strange habits. I drank incredibly strong black tea. Like at the age of 6, I was brewing myself tea whenever I could get away with it without my parents finding out. I sat cross-legged on the floor. I would never sit in furniture. It took years to train me to sit in chairs. And lots of things. I remembered various ways that I died. I would ask my mother, I say, well, do you remember when I drowned? Why did I drown? She didn't know what I was talking about. But as I grew older and learned about the concept of reincarnation, I realized that I had all these experiences. I want to very quickly say I don't remember being any pharaoh, anyone famous, anything like that. I think unfortunately, there's a lot of nonsense associated with reincarnation. And
such as the idea, why does everybody think they were Cleopatra?
Right, which I think people, if you have 8 people who think they're Cleopatra, you don't have evidence of reincarnation, but of something a bit more frivolous.
Yeah.
And
but the research doesn't show that everybody thinks they were somebody famous.
No, quite the contrary. There's a past life researcher, a psychologist named Helen Wambach, who's deceased now, but she regressed large groups of people, hundreds, and sent them back to various past lives. And what she would do is she would pick a time period, for example, the 1850s, 60s, and say, what were you alive then? And if so, where were you? Figuring that if people were fantasizing, even at an unconscious level, that they would associate that time period with the Civil War, and she would come up with a lot of Civil War past lives. She didn't. And in fact, in all these literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples of past lives, she had no one who remembered being anyone famous. She also had things that seemed to very much mesh with historical reality. Only 10% of the past lives that her subjects had lived were lived as aristocratic lives or in lives of luxury. Mm-hmm. The other 90% were grueling as peasants, as laborers, eking out, hunter-gatherers, that sort of thing. And some very interesting historical pieces of information came out. Like she'd started to discover that at various time periods, people described forks as having, like at one point, people said forks had 2 prongs, then they had 3, then they had 4. And this is a very obscure historical fact, but that is the progression of the fork. So there are things like that, but as I say, no famous people, and it did seem to reflect historical reality, not fantasy, because who would fantasize being a peasant or a laborer,
Well, now, we've talked about past lives, we've talked about poltergeists, we've talked about UFOs, and we've talked about the holographic model in science. How do you integrate these?
Well, I think they're all part of the same reality, that we live in a spiritual universe, that I very much believe that our soul lives many, many lives and goes through these things. And I think at this point in our development that we have manifested in the physical because we don't have a consciousness that's developed enough to deal with reality with its full grandeur and plasticity. That for us it would be very frightening if there weren't solid rules, if everything started to slip and slide. But I think as your soul goes along, it starts to learn to deal with more than this reality, with other levels on the holographic television set. And when you start to open those doorways, that's when reality, the plasticity of reality, starts to seep in. But then you go through a sort of shamanistic rite of passage, because you've got to go through, most people go, put an interpretation on it. They go, oh, this is an angel, or this is, a demon, or a UFO abduction. And if you do that, you're missing the basic lesson of shamanism, which is that everything that you experience in the non-ordinary reality of the shaman has psychological meaning for you, that you are entering a level of reality that responds so directly to your thoughts that your every thought helps what manifests. And in that instance, you can't ask what is there, but why have I created what is there? And I think that's the lesson that our souls are learning as we evolve.
In other words, one might say that these various so-called paranormal experiences are what my friend and mentor Arthur Young would call, oh wow, kinds of experiences. They serve another purpose, and it's not an obvious purpose necessarily, but perhaps ultimately it's to push us somehow into a higher state of consciousness, to force us to try and understand the deeper meaning.
I agree with that, and they're a natural manifestation of the evolution of consciousness. As your soul evolves, you start to open up the plastic levels of reality, and these things start to enter. And that in itself teaches you, that it may not necessarily be that the universe is saying, here, I'm giving you this to teach you, but you are manifesting what you have to learn about yourself. And just as we manifest moods and beliefs that we have to learn about if we're to deal with them properly. These are things that manifest in a very profound and paranormal way. but our part are still Rorschachs, as you said, or ink blots of who and what we are as souls. You know.